What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Friday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over the wide receivers, starts and sits for Week 15 in the fantasy playoffs. As per usual, we're going matchup by matchup, so you overall know how we do feel about each player. But don't forget, guys, the website is completely free. That's right, anyone can access the rankings to help you with those tougher start and sit decisions. Not only that, though, you can gain access to all of our DFS information, sports betting picks as well, and like I said, it's all completely free. That is available at thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that, as always, in the description box below. With that being said, though, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which player currently has the second most drops in the league. The correct answer was actually DK Metcalf. The first person to get that one right is Andrew Hayes. As for today's stat of the day, which quarterback has currently thrown the most interceptions inside the 10-yard line? Once again, that's which quarterback inside the 10-yard line has thrown the most interceptions. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With that out of the way, let's hop right into the matchups. This week, we have the luxury of having two Saturday matchups. The first one being Buffalo versus Denver, starting with Buffalo, who definitely has the higher end receivers. Despite this team heading into the game as nearly a touchdown favorite, that shouldn't concern you all that much with the potential passing volume in this game. Despite Josh Allen being one of the more mobile quarterbacks in the league, this team still passes it at one of the higher rates in the league. Even more recently, over the past two matchups in games against tough defenses like San Francisco and Pittsburgh, Josh Allen had 40 plus pass attempts in each contest, a mark he's been able to hit in 3 of the past 4 games. When it comes to the Denver matchup specifically, they've been very tight in the red zone. They actually have not allowed a wide receiver to catch a touchdown over the past 3 weeks, and that includes matchups against Kansas City as well as the Saints. Even though the Broncos have been strong in that area, they've still been allowing a significant amount of volume to go to that position, and with the target funnel on the Buffalo offense mainly going through both Stephon Diggs and Cole Beasley, it means the floor for both of these players in this matchup should be relatively high. All things considered, though, with the Broncos only allowing 1 receiving touchdown since week 9 to a wide receiver, that is going to overall impact exactly how high we rank each of those receivers. Stephon Diggs, though, a top 10 receiver for us this week as well as almost every week so far this season. As for Cole Beasley, a player coming off of 2 double-digit target games, you can safely start him as a high-end 3, and although his 10 targets last week only resulted in 5 receptions for 41 yards, if he is going to get that much volume in this game, the results that show on the field in his production should be much higher than they were against Pittsburgh. On the other side for Denver, although Drew Lock is playing well, and each receiver, whether it be Jerry Jeudy, Tim Patrick, or KJ Hamler, has each stepped up at different parts of the season, there's really only one receiver we could possibly think of inserting in our lineups, and no, it's not Jerry Jeudy, it's actually Tim Patrick. Tim Patrick has quietly been one of the most efficient receiving threats inside of the 10-yard line. On 7 targets in that area so far this season, he's caught all 7 of them for a 100% catch rate. 6 of those receptions went for a touchdown, and in this week in a matchup against Buffalo, it's an area that's definitely been an Achilles heel for this defense. They've allowed a receiving touchdown to a wide receiver in every game since week 8. Through that span, we have 2 double-digit touchdown performances, and with that strength matching up with the recent weakness in the Buffalo defense, Tim Patrick definitely has some upside if you start him in the flex. We still do have him ranked just outside the top 40 though, so if your team is stacked, you likely do have a better option. But as for KJ Hamler, a player coming off of a pretty massive performance with 2 touchdowns, we do have to take that performance with a grain of salt. It was a 3-target game, and Jerry Jeudy, despite starting off the season as the most involved wide receiver, he's had a high of 4 targets over the past 3 contests. Moving into the next Saturday matchup, we have the Green Bay Packers versus the Carolina Panthers. On the Green Bay side of things, this is a complete smash spot for Devontae Adams. Adams is heading into this matchup leading the league in red zone targets. Aaron Rodgers boasts the league's best touchdown rate, and this is coming in a matchup against the Carolina Panthers, who have been trending down against opposing wide receivers, so much so that they've allowed 6 receiving touchdowns to that position over the past 2 weeks. 3 passing touchdowns to wide receivers is definitely a feat Aaron Rodgers can accomplish in this matchup, and with the target distribution heavily favoring favoring Devontae Adams, the odds of him getting 1 or possibly 2+ touchdowns in this matchup is significantly high. As for MVS and Allen Lazard, MVS made it pretty simple for our decision this week, and no, it's not because he went 6 for 6 himself, compiling 85 receiving yards and a touchdown. No, it's because he made the decision on whether we start Allen Lazard or not much easier by knowing we should avoid him. The volume and target splits between Lazard and MVS have been flip-flopping back and forth over the past few weeks, and even though this is somewhat of an exceptional matchup for wide receivers, Allen Lazard really hasn't shown us the type of upside we're looking for in flex players so far, so the risk in starting him really doesn't make it worth the reward. On the other side of the ball, for Carolina, all 3 receivers are in play. We have Curtis Samuel, DJ Moore, and Robbie Anderson all likely to suit up. Curtis Samuel surprisingly probably matches up against this defense more positively than the other 2 receivers. Curtis Samuel, for that reason, is going to be ranked inside the top 30. With the Packers passing defense being a stout one, a versatile player like Curtis Samuel should be in a position to get himself involved in multiple different areas, something we saw in full effect last week and several times throughout this season. So for us, we view him as a top 30 option. As for DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, who draw the much tougher matchups, they should more than make up for that in volume, and while Robbie Anderson did have the luxury of not playing alongside DJ Moore last week, we still shouldn't overall be concerned with the volume going to Robbie Anderson. Keep in mind, the Carolina Panthers heading into this game are 8.5 point underdogs, so there should be plenty of passing volume to go around, and DJ Moore, as an addition that they didn't have last week, could potentially open up more offensive plays and scoring opportunities. With this being a tougher matchup though, we do still have to temper our expectations. DJ Moore still a top 30 player nonetheless, somebody we should feel more comfortable starting as a wide receiver 3 though, and Robbie Anderson, we have him slotted out as a back end 2. Alright guys, we're moving over to the Sunday games, and to start this one off, we have a banger. It's the Detroit Lions versus the Tennessee Titans. 2 very weak pass defenses and 2 passing offenses that can definitely exploit those positive matchups. When it comes to AJ Brown, a player who can score from any area of the field, this matchup will be extra fruitful for him. That has been one area of weakness of the Detroit Lions passing defense all season long. For that, we have him ranked inside the top 5 this week, and Corey Davis, a player who should do much of his damage between the 20s. The only thing I'm overall concerned about him is the fact that it is Derek December. While the Detroit Lions passing defense is pretty weak, it's exceptionally weak against opposing running backs, so with Corey Davis being a bit weaker in the deep receiving department, I would be a bit concerned with his overall potential to score in the red zone, because they can always punch it in with Derrick Henry, and they are of course coming into this matchup as 10.5 point favorites. Regardless though, we do still have Corey Davis ranked as a back end wide receiver 2 in this matchup, so if you own him, do your best to get him in the lineup. And on the other side of the ball, Marvin Jones makes a really strong start. The Detroit Lions don't have the luxury of having an extremely strong rushing attack, and with Kenny Golladay out, Marvin Jones is going to be the main weapon in the passing game against a defense that has allowed the second most fantasy points to receivers on the season. With the Lions being double-digit point underdogs in this matchup, there should be much more passing volume to go around as well, so Marvin Jones and the chance of him hitting his ceiling, it's much stronger in this matchup, so we have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 2, and if you own him and have the ability to start him in your flex, you should be excited at the potential for his upside in this matchup. The next matchup we have is the Dallas Cowboys versus the San Francisco 49ers. Easily the most polarizing player in this matchup definitely has to be Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk in this one has undeniable top 12 upside. It's a matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, who've been giving it up to the wide receiver position all season long. Brandon Ayuk himself has been a 100+ yard or receiving touchdown machine, and with his versatility and the team's ability to get him involved, utilizing his skill set in yards after catch, it does give him a sneaky high floor, quite possibly one of the sneakiest floors of all receivers with top 12 upside this week. As for Dallas, we're obviously starting Amari Cooper. I'm not 100% thrilled about the matchup he draws this week though. Dallas will have the added benefit though of coming into this game as an underdog. Andy Dalton though, he's been spreading around the ball very efficiently, but with this being a game where possibly the wide receiver 1 could have some struggles, that definitely opens up more opportunities for CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup. Unfortunately for Michael Gallup, we've seen a large enough sample size for him where the odds of him hitting the return just isn't worth the risk in starting him. As for CeeDee Lamb though, he definitely has the upside we're looking for when inserting players into the flex spot. The floor for him can certainly be called into question, but if we are going to bank on one receiver outside of Amari Cooper possibly performing in this overall negative passing matchup, CeeDee Lamb would definitely be the player we put our chips on. We have him ranked as the wide receiver 36 picks this week, so a startable asset nonetheless. The next matchup we have is the Chicago Bears versus the Minnesota Vikings. On the Chicago side of the ball, it's pretty simple. Allen Robinson, he's clearly an auto start each and every week. He draws yet another soft matchup. Since we don't have any questions on whether we're starting him, the only questions have to be whether he has a really high ceiling in this week or not, and that is undeniable. The Minnesota Vikings have been giving it up all season long to that position. They've been torched by much less talented receivers outside of Allen Robinson. The Chicago offense is also getting hot, so heading into this matchup, a receiver like A-Rob, who virtually has a 6 reception floor, he's going to be a premier wide receiver 1, and one that you can definitely trust will not have a dud. On the other side of the ball, I'm not as thrilled for this matchup when it comes to Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson. The Chicago defense has been very smothering to opposing wide receivers, but regardless, these are two proven performers who have been producing like wide receiver 1s. I would not be surprised whatsoever if one of these two receivers does pop off for a top 10 finish. Both of them we do have ranked inside of the top 12 just due to their upside, but considering how tight the Chicago Bears defense does play against opposing wide receivers, we can't be completely shocked if it ends up being a disappointment spot for one of these two wide receivers. Moving into the next matchup, we have some fireworks. It's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Atlanta Falcons. In this one, we're moving forward with the notion that Julio Jones will not be playing, which does give a bump up to Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley coming off of a spectacular performance himself. I will say, however, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, while on paper seem like a weak defense to start your wide receivers against, I do believe they are a bit underrated, but what the Falcons do have going in their favor is that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers should have no problem picking apart this passing defense, which means there is the potential for a lot of points to be racked up on the Tampa Bay side of things, forcing the Atlanta Falcons into a very pass-heavy game script, which should bring into play garbage time production, which could negate some of the difficulties that Matt Ryan may face in this defense. Russell Gage is 100% in play this week. Although we don't have him ranked inside the top 36, he is still ranked inside the top 40, so if you somehow made it to the fantasy playoffs and are weak at the wide receiver position, a desperation play of Russell Gage, who may even be found on waiver wires, could definitely get it done for you this week. As for Tampa Bay, I already highlighted that Tom Brady and the Buccaneers should have no problem in the passing game getting the job done. Obviously, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, they're going to be top 20 players ranked each and every week. The edge definitely going to Mike Evans, who's been a scoring machine overall with Tom Brady. Chris Godwin, while he has been taking the biggest hit with the addition of Antonio Brown, he still has been producing, and in this matchup, the concerns with Antonio Brown potentially soaking up some of his target market share, they really shouldn't come in and play a factor in this matchup because the Atlanta Falcons have been allowing the second most fantasy points on this season, and it's a trend they haven't been able to clean up even heading into week 15. Antonio Brown, the receiver we have ranked as more of a wide receiver 3 in this matchup. If I am an AB owner, I'm still doing whatever I can to put him in. This is definitely the type of matchup he can exploit because regardless of whichever receiver Tom Brady's targeting, each one should have plenty of success in this matchup. The next game we have is the Houston Texans versus the Indianapolis Colts. In this one, we have the luxury of seeing these teams face off 2 weeks prior, and in that matchup, similarly to what Kiki Kuti has been doing against this defense throughout his career, Kiki Kuti completely popped off. Like I said, that performance, it was not uncommon against this defense, meaning we can 100% get behind the notion of starting Kiki Kuti in this otherwise difficult matchup. Like I did say, this is a difficult matchup for wide receivers. This will be a bump down to a player like Brandon Cooks, who plays the primary receiver role in this offense, a role that the Indianapolis Colts are much stronger at defending, so the gap in ranking between Brandon Cooks, who is actually ranked higher, it is only a 5-player gap between Cooks and Kiki Kuti. Regardless, we feel comfortable starting both of them as back-end 3s, players you would much more prefer to put in your flex spot. And on the other side of the ball for Indianapolis, we have to be putting in T.Y. Hilton. T.Y. Hilton has been on an absolute tear as of late. It lines up perfectly with the increased performance of Phillip Rivers, something that we have been expecting. Since this is his first year on a new team, the odds of him producing towards the tail end of the season, it should be much more consistently in line of what we should expect moving forward, as opposed to what we saw at the beginning of the season. Similarly to Kiki Kuti, we've also seen T.Y. Hilton perform against this defense, a defense that has been consistently torched by wide receivers all season long, and with a 50.5 point projected total, there should be no wonder as to why we have T.Y. Hilton ranked inside of the top 20 this week. Outside of him, Michael Pittman is definitely in play for desperate owners. Michael Pittman likely not a player who helped you get to where you are, but if you've been a person who's been suffering injuries, maybe your lineup heading into week 15 is pretty thin, again, this matchup against the Houston Texans is definitely a defense that can be exploited by Phillip Rivers, and Michael Pittman, he has shown flashes, so if there were a time for him to produce, it would definitely be in a matchup like this one against Houston, so certainly a player that should be in your flex consideration. Moving into one of the more polarizing matchups, we have the Washington football team versus the Seattle Seahawks. The reason I mention this matchup being polarizing definitely comes down to the fact that the Seattle Seahawks, one of the most high-powered passing offenses, led by DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, are facing a really difficult matchup against the Washington football team. Meanwhile, on the other side, Terry McLaurin, a receiver who's been struggling as of late, finds himself in the prime matchup facing the league's worst passing defense against opposing wide receivers. For both of these teams, I believe we definitely have to set our expectations appropriately and meet somewhere in the middle. For DK Metcalf, it's impossible not to rank him as a wide receiver 1, but we do have to be mindful he has the second most drops in the league. This is a really difficult matchup, so if he doesn't carry our teams to victory this week like he has done many times in weeks past, we can't be all that disappointed with him. As for Tyler Lockett though, we have seen historically in these more difficult matchups, Russell Wilson has had a reliance on Tyler Lockett. That lone factor though can't be a reason that we shrink the gap between both Lockett and DK Metcalf in the rankings. Lockett will still be ranked as a premier top 20 option though. Even in this difficult matchup, he definitely has the upside, but we know when it comes to Lockett, he plays very hot and cold. On the other side of the ball, I can definitely see this as a get right game for Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin, who's been coming off of 2 less than stellar performances, we have him ranked as the 15th wide receiver this week, and heading into this matchup, there is always the potential for Terry McLaurin to post the best game that he has all season long. The next matchup we have definitely isn't going to be as exciting for the wide receivers in the fantasy space. It's the New England Patriots versus the Miami Dolphins. Big news here, Devontae Parker, he's injured. We're unsure at this time if he will play, and if he does play, in what capacity. Will he be limited? He's also a player we've seen who, when playing injured, has had early exits in games in the past, which means his floor is virtually non-existent, and it's not like this matchup against the New England Patriots was a positive one to begin with. Outside of Parker though, I really wouldn't be interested in starting any other Miami receiver. I do kind of like Lynn Bowden in this matchup, a running back with a very versatile pass catching skill set. If this offense does have some difficulties moving the ball downfield, they could definitely rely on the short and intermediate routes of Lynn Bowden. Lynn Bowden has the added bonus of being able to be started in the running back slot, so for those of you who may have lost players like Joe Mixon and have been filling that spot with players on your bench, Lynn Bowden's receiving floor could definitely ensure you don't get a 0 in that slot. As for New England though, Cam Newton has been pitiful when it comes to passing offense. Even the receiver we like the most on this offense, being Jacoby Myers, we really can't recommend you start him even in the flex. The projected total in this game is a mere 41.5 points, especially considering Cam Newton's willingness to run the ball in that area of the field. The expectations for touchdowns should be pretty low, rendering Jacoby Myers even outside of our flex consideration this week. The next matchup we have doesn't have as many super relevant fantasy players, or at least not many that were drafted and are on many playoff teams. We have the Baltimore Ravens versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. On the Baltimore side of things, Marquise Brown, the only receiver we would be considering starting. Whenever we do put Marquise Brown in the lineup, we know we're playing with fire. If there was a matchup to try to milk the most out of Marquise Brown though, putting him in a matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars would definitely be a recipe for some success. When it comes to Brown though, we know start him at your own risk. We do have him ranked just outside the top 30, but inside the top 36, which means for most teams out there, Marquise Brown is going to crack the starting lineup. On the other side for Jacksonville, while the Baltimore Ravens passing defense has certainly been trending down as of late, and Gardner Minshew stepping in, taking over for Mike Glennon and will be the starter this week, has proven to have a really solid connection with DJ Chark in the past. Relying on the recent sample of the Baltimore passing defense could end up being risky for you. DJ Chark has also been a player who most teams have not been relying on leading into the playoffs, so for him to be your only option at this point, it's just not a likely scenario, so I can definitely condone sitting him. Regardless though, we are still going to have him ranked inside the top 40, and when it comes to DJ Chark, one of the players who from a talent talent standpoint, brings in a ceiling that can match anyone on any given Sunday. If you're in a desperate situation facing a team and are projected to lose by 20 plus points, what do you really have to lose by putting DJ Chark in your lineup? The next matchup we have is the LA Rams versus the New York Jets, and for you owners of Rams wide receivers out there, you should rejoice in knowing you have a really solid matchup for Week 15. Both Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp we have ranked as extremely high wide receiver 2s. Despite the Rams coming into this matchup as nearly 2 touchdown favorites, we really shouldn't concern ourselves all that much with the potential impact it has to the passing game. The Jets have been heavy underdogs in every game that they've came into and have still been allowing an excessive amount of fantasy points to wide receivers, and Robert Woods, although he is coming off of a mediocre performance, he's been one of the safest wide receiver 2s you could start all season long, and even in his bad performance or down performance, he still had 8 targets. They gave him a carry out of the backfield. What more could you really ask for out of your wide receiver 2? As for the Jets side of things, we really can't recommend starting any wide receivers. We can't forget that the LA Rams are the best defense at mitigating fantasy points to that position, and Jamison Crowder, the receiver who's had the most consistent involvement in this offense, he's coming off of a major dud, rendering the trust level we have for any of these New York Jets wide receivers virtually non-existent, especially in the most difficult matchup we could possibly ask for. The next matchup we have is the Arizona Cardinals versus the Philadelphia Eagles. This game is very simple from a fantasy perspective. On the Arizona side of things, we have DeAndre Hopkins. D-Hop is going to be the only Arizona receiver we're considering starting in this matchup. We have him ranked as a top 3 receiver this week, and even though the Philadelphia Eagles have been very beatable through the air as of late, we still can't use that as a reason to start Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk, while always a threat to score from any part of the field, has not been able to eclipse 3 receptions since week 11. He also hasn't been able to eclipse 19 receiving yards through that same span, so the floor for him is much too low for us to consider as a start. On the other side of the ball for the Eagles, even with the increased performance of Jalen Hurts boosting this overall offense, we haven't seen enough out of the wide receivers to be able to trust one. If you've made it this far in the season, it hasn't been on the back of any Philadelphia receivers either, so why put yourself in a position where you're going to have to rely on one when your entire season is on the line? The next game we have is the New Orleans Saints versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Starting with the Chiefs side of things, Tyreek Hill, you should be very excited for him in this matchup. The ceiling for him is extremely high, while the New Orleans Saints defense on this season has been one of the better at mitigating fantasy points to wide receivers. We've also seen several times throughout this season they've allowed massive performances. In week 13, they allowed 262 receiving yards to wide receivers, week 11, 225, week 8, 239 to Chicago, and over 200 in week 7 to Carolina. That makes 3 out of their last 6 games where receivers have been able to top 200 receiving yards. Tyreek Hill himself, we've seen him hit the high end of his production, getting streaky with 3 triple-digit receiving yard performances in a row. Definitely a feat he could bring to the table in this matchup against New Orleans. The Saints over the second half of the season have been one of the best, if not the best defense at defending opposing fantasy tight ends. So if Travis Kelce does struggle at any point in this game with the receiving funnel at the wide receiver position heavily favoring Tyreek Hill, the chances of him having a monster performance are definitely up there. As for the Saints, we can't say with certainty that Michael Thomas will play. Whether he plays or not, he's the only receiver we're even considering starting in this matchup. And if he does play, even though the Kansas City Chiefs are a matchup we typically try to avoid for wide receivers, Michael Thomas and the connection between him and Taysom Hill, it's strong enough to overcome this matchup. Over the past 4 weeks, he's had 2 double-digit target performances. Last week, he showed his efficiency with Taysom Hill, catching 8 of his 8 targets for 84 yards, showing exactly what type of floor he brings to the table each and every week. Alright guys, moving into the next one, we have the New York Giants versus the Cleveland Browns. The big news in this matchup certainly comes with the news that James Bradberry was placed on the COVID reserve list. Bradberry being one of the most underrated corners in the league so far this year, so losing out on him does have the potential to impact this matchup. When it comes to the fantasy assets we're considering starting, it's really only Jarvis Landry. While Bradberry may not have shadowed Jarvis Landry, what we do know is that if this does open up opportunities for other receivers in this offense, that could ultimately end up in more scoring opportunities for Jarvis Landry, increasing the overall upside he brings in this matchup that he otherwise wouldn't have. Heading into this week, we have him ranked as the wide receiver 26. He's had no fewer than 6 receptions over each of the past 3 contests. He's scored in 2 out of 3 of those games. So heading into this matchup against the New York Giants, one that most people wouldn't be thrilled about, he does have some sneaky upside this week. As for the Giants, offense. We really don't know at this point if Daniel Jones is going to play. In addition to the hamstring injury, he now also has an ankle injury. Overall, he hasn't been playing that well either. So even if Colt McCoy does step in, we can't sit here and say that it's a massive impact to the receivers in this passing game. No, that's not a testament to how strong Colt McCoy is. It more outlines the struggles that Daniel Jones has had as of late. For this reason though, we really don't want to start any receiver in this passing attack. The highest ranked wide receiver we have is Sterling Shepard. He comes in at wide receiver 45, so he's on the cusp of a player you could put in your flex, but even in this positive matchup, we would likely opt for a better option. Moving into the final matchup, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Most people's questions heading into this matchup is, what do I do with Diontae Johnson? As we know, he is now Deontay Dropson, was benched last week for dropping several passes early on in the game, which does bring into question on if he struggles this week early on in the game, potentially dropping one or two passes early on. Could that impact his playtime for the remainder of the contest? Definitely. That is going to render his floor extremely low in this matchup. As we know though, he does bring in a type of upside that hardly any receiver brings in week over week. He's a target monster. So the risk versus reward, it's still a formula that can pay off for your fantasy team. If you're stacked at wide receiver though and are safe to win this matchup barring anything crazy happens, maybe you opt for a safer option. And with Deontay having that in his range of outcomes, that does mean the other receivers in this offense have a bit more upside in their range of outcomes. If there is a world where Diontae Johnson is benched early on, that means the targets that would normally go to Diontae Johnson are going to be spread elsewhere. So the theoretical upside for players like Juju and Chase Claypool is going to be higher in this matchup. Juju Smith-Schuster we do have ranked inside the top 30. Chase Claypool more of a flex play, but this is a beatable defense in the Cincinnati Bengals. The last time these two teams faced this season, Chase Claypool had 2 receiving touchdowns and Juju Smith-Schuster had 9 receptions for 77 yards and a touchdown himself. On the other side of the ball for Cincinnati, there are only 2 receivers in consideration for starting. Both of them have been rendered flex plays in this matchup against Pittsburgh. T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd, we have them ranked back to back, and we can't say we're all that thrilled about getting them in this week. Even though the Pittsburgh Steelers were allowing big games to players like Stephon Diggs as of late, Brandon Allen, he is no Josh Allen. We don't even know for certain if Brandon Allen will be the starter, and behind him it gets even murkier. Combine that with the fact that they're facing the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course. The Steelers on the season, they may not look like a scary defense to start your receivers against, but they started very weak in the early part of the season at defending that position, and outside of this recent match with Buffalo, have been very stingy to say the least. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.